Okay, thank you very much. I'm in a very strange position because last night there was the roundtable when basically I talked about most of the things that I want to say. So for some of you it will be some level of repetition. I'll try to say things that you didn't hear yesterday. I hope to extend it a little bit. But there are people in the room who weren't there yesterday, so hopefully there'll be quite a few people who hear it for the first time. So the thesis that I'm trying to expose here is that when we had economic transition, political and economic transition around 89-90, basically with the package of political liberalism and cultural liberalism, the transition can be characterized also by the introduction of economic liberalism, which is often called neoliberalism. It's quite understandable why the region was so receptive to neoliberalism. I think that most of the economists in the region who became prominent around transition time were socialized into a neoliberal critique or a neoclassical neoliberal critique of I would even extend it, an Austrian neoclassical neoliberal critique of the Soviet system or the Yugoslav system in your case. And so because their socialization in their youth was so much a critique of that system, they were very receptive towards these ideas. They were also middle-class people. Middle-class people are much more perceptive to economic liberalism, and so on and so on. There are various reasons why it happened. Also, the political context outside of the region, so the global sort of zeitgeist, economic zeitgeist, was one of neoliberalism. This is the peak, basically, when Thatcher and Reagan are in power. Social democracy is in a bit of a crisis. All kinds of statist narratives are basically at their lowest levels. And even the left wing had already been neoliberalized, so Craxi, Mitterrand already happened. Blair was about to happen. Giddens was already working on his book, and etc. So later Schröder happened, and so on and so on. So basically. The economic context and also the institutional context can be characterized by the Washington Consensus. So all the outside conditionality, the EU was pushing for economic liberalization, but also the World Bank and the IMF and so on, they were all pushing for the elements of the Washington Consensus. So it's understandable why basically the main economic kind of thrust of the transition period is one of economic liberalism. What does economic liberalism lead to? I think that the reason why the Piketty book, the Thomas Piketty book, Capitalism in the 21st Century, is so important is because now we have empirical proof that without the redistributive mechanisms of the welfare states, we have economic polarization. He demonstrates this for the US, for the UK, and for France, but I think that's generalizable for other parts of the world as well. Other authors demonstrated them. Wolfgang Streeck demonstrates it for Germany. Other authors demonstrate it even for Scandinavia. The less the state is active, the more economic polarization happens. You get a super rich elite becoming exponentially richer. You get a middle class which is basically stagnating or slowly decaying, and you get a massive underclass and the precariat. To use the words of, to use this favorite word of Guy Standing, you get a very, very voluminous, precarious population of students and part-time workers and interns and etc., etc. So you get economic polarization. If you get economic polarization without the Piketty demonstrates that the only time when the middle class was strengthening and there was the opposite of economic polarization, some kind of strengthening of the middle class, was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when we had the redistributive systems in the West. But to the populations of Central and Eastern Europe, welfare states are kind of portrayed in 1989 as something of the past, a relic of the past. Keynesian economic policies also portrayed as a relic of the past. So don't do any of those, because those are over for various reasons, for reasons of, you know, the trade unions becoming too pushy, for demographic reasons, etc., etc. All of these can be demonstrated to be false empirically, but there is a very strong conviction in the populations of Central and Eastern Europe not to try to emulate any of those models. Actually, the majority of the population are not even aware of the existence of those models, so the whole variety of capitalisms debate that there are all kinds of capitalisms doesn't even exist. It's not brought into the region. Neoliberal capitalism is demonstrated as capitalism, so as a generic capitalism, and the debate which takes place in many Western European countries about varieties of capitalism is always brought back to this dichotomy of communism versus capitalism in the region. So whenever you want to expand this debate, they always drag it back to this dichotomy of, you're criticizing capitalism, obviously you want communism, we've seen what communism is like, so capitalism is the best existing form, and therefore it's very, very difficult to actually start a kind of debate about the institutions of other systems, other forms of capitalism, forms other than the Anglo-Saxon type neoliberalism that is brought into this region. Then I quote this famous author, a theoretician of the Nordic model, Gösta Esping Andersen, who basically says that in order for democracy to operate, you need a strong middle class. The Scandinavian model in this sense is not only an economic issue, it's not only a social economic meritocratic issue, which I think fulfills as the only existing form of a society which ever fulfilled Rawls's criteria for justice, for social justice. But it's also a democratic project in the sense that he makes the claim that only through having a strong middle class can you control the elites, the political elites. Only through a strong middle class can you actually have active participation. And he defines the middle class as, on the one hand, people who have a material independence strong enough to withstand the pressures of clientelistic networks. So basically people who have the dignity and the confidence to stand up and speak truth to power, be power, their own bosses or politicians or whoever. If you don't have these people, and you can demonstrate that in the region of Central and Eastern Europe, there is a very, very, very sort of narrow group of people who have enough material independence to be able to act this way. The other definition, the other part of the definition is that they are educated enough, so basically that they have enough knowledge of the understanding the very complex debates that take place today. I quoted yesterday 3 examples. We have debates about nuclear power, the Eurozone, and the Syrian conflict. These are my favorite 3 examples of incredibly difficult debates about which you vote when you actually go and vote for a political party, what their positions are on these, or global warming, or you can quote a large number of very, very serious and very complicated issues. You need an incredibly high degree of education, of knowledge, to be able to participate in those debates. If you don't have that, you have very simple schemes. Most of these schemes actually are based on nationalism. I have to say that these very simplistic schemes are often based about nationalist identity rather than any socio-economic understanding of what goes on in the world. And if you have these very simplistic understandings, that you become a captive of populist politicians, demagogues who go around spreading very simplistic ideas and capture votes and create cohesive political communities based on the demonization of others. Obviously, I don't think populism is always bad. I agree with Chantal Mouffe and that school which says populism can be a good thing. So the kind of populism which is, listens to the people and understands their voices. I mean, I call neoliberalism populism. I think neoliberalism. I don't. It's not me who does that. Actually, it's a Dutch author called Martin Koning who came up with this concept that basically, just like any other ideology, neoliberalism can basically go into overdrive, and it can also become, while it has a very valid criticism, I think, of the Soviet system. So some points of economy. I teach myself Hayek and von Mises, and their criticisms of the Soviet systems, I think, are quite valid. But when it runs into overdrive, it becomes economic populism. So, for instance, the whole discourse of austerity, Martin Koning argues, gives you this feeling that the neoliberalism is popular. You have to understand this, that the political left often portrays neoliberalism as a kind of imposition. And it happens sometimes that they do impose their will against democratic politics. I think that the treatment of the Syriza government of Greece is a very good example of neoliberalism being imposed. Basically, the European Central Bank was used at the beginning of this year to cripple the Greek banking system against the statutes of the European Central Bank. So basically, the EU architecture was used to anti-democratically cripple a democratically elected government. I'm very, very strong on that. It's a very strong conviction, and it's not only me saying it, it's leading theoreticians of the Eurozone like Paul de Grove or Charles Wiplosch, Barry Eichengreen, people you can't even call theoreticians of any left-wing policies. They're basically liberal experts of the Eurozone. They agree that the ECB was misused. So it does happen that neoliberalism is sometimes imposed upon populations against their democratic will, but very often neoliberalism is popular, and the reason why it's popular is because it appeals to the meritocratic instincts of much of the population. So it gives people the feeling that the markets are going to do wonders, it's meritocratic, it's like the Protestant ethic, you need to clear up, people live beyond their means, I don't live beyond their means, or if I do, then I have to cut back a little bit, why shouldn't other people, why shouldn't the Greeks? So it has these very simplistic narratives which completely ignore the realities of the captured state, because neoliberalism then leads to the captured state situation. Because if you don't have a population which is which has a strong middle class, and I would argue that in most of our countries of Central and Eastern Europe, we have a very tiny fraction of the population which fulfills both criteria. So even the education criteria only applies to a very small segment of society, but the education criteria and the material independence criteria together apply, that the overlap between the two is, I would argue, that in most of our societies, a single-digit % of the population. And not surprisingly, the majority are captured by very populist politicians, and if you have very populist politicians, then you have a captured state situation. We have intransparent campaign financing. The majority of our populations do not see, I mean, even very educated people fail to see the captured state situation. They don't see how the nexus between big business and political governance is important. They don't see what the reciprocation of this nexus is, what it is that is granted to these large corporations and business elites in exchange for the material support which the politicians receive. They fail to see the whole connectedness, and they are easily captured by this political demonization which populist politics does. And it's not only the nationalists, the liberal parties themselves also have this kind of demonization. We are the westernizers, and those guys are the enemy. But it's not like we want to really change the situation. We don't want to emancipate the rest of society economically or socially. We don't really want to create. We don't want to sacrifice our social positions to create a wider middle class. We just want to reimpose the liberal economic order that exists when nationalists are not in power. So it's an alternation of liberals and nationalists with the complete exclusion of the majority of the society, and no attempt to formulate any policy which would widen the middle classes and bring in, much like in the Scandinavian states, where they deliberately attempted to bring in a wide masses of society and create a middle class which is able to implement democracy. So that's the whole narrative that I think we can construct of what happened since transition. This greatly weakens our democracies, and as we can all see, our democracies become empty shells. All the formalities are there, but in reality the content disappears. No positive policies are formulated. Policy formulation, progressive policy formulation is replaced by basically demonization of the other. If you read the news is all about corruption, so corruption replaces social dialogue and interest harmonization. People turn away from politics because they're disappointed. The people who remain are captured by the demonization. The people who have some sense, they turn away from politics and see it as hopeless. So there is a general sense of complete disappointment with the project of the 1989 liberal turn. So basically, in this sense, neoliberalism as the economic dimension of liberalism turns against the political aspirations of liberalism to create a society where human rights and constitutional freedoms, etc., rule, and so it's detrimental. And there's a very, very gaping absence of social democratic or redistributive, I don't know what, we have a bit of a terminological debate amongst us in these few days, but basically if I don't want to term it social democratic, then I will use the term redistributive. So basically there is an absence of political parties whose central focus could be creating the social basis of political democracy through redistributive means. That's the argument. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to put two interrelated questions. First brings out epistemological issues. The second one refers to the paths of liberalism within the late capitalism. So in fact, the issue that concerns me leads to the simple question: has a self-proclaimed missionary project such as neoliberalism, with the purpose of comprehensive revision of basic categories of liberalism, damaged the normative capacities of liberalism? Has this project retrospectively changed the meanings and the stake of liberalism? That is the affirmation of the non-instrumental freedom. Has the dominating neoliberalism, even after its cul-de-sac in ongoing crisis, revealed the Achilles heel of liberalism? Is this possible, this I think to anticipate of my conclusion, is this possible to be pro-capitalist and anti-liberal at the same time? Is it possible to be pro-bourgeois and anti-liberal at the same time? So immediately after the Second World War, Friedrich Hayek, who proved to be a spiritus movens for the neoliberalism, lamented that the political terms became ambiguous and the terms like liberalism and capitalism no longer stood for a coherent system of ideas. And this critical account could be seen as the trigger for the comprehensive rearrangement of allegedly weakened and too naive liberalism. So let's recall the fact that during the early period of ascending neoliberalism, that is during the 40s and 50s of 20th century, we could see a very clear self-identification of neoliberals as the bearers of the mission of the purging of exhausted liberalism. Therefore, the neoliberal therapeutic came to the surface self-consciously as the politico-economic purgatorium for the drained liberalism in the first half of the 20th century. But today the situation is much more complicated by the manifestly absence of such mentioned self-identification. So my position represents a certain form of middle way. On the one hand, I counter to the widespread agnostic account today that neoliberalism is despairingly dispersed referent or hopelessly floating signifier. But on the other hand, I must acknowledge that this referent, namely neoliberalism, reflects the problem of naming within the sphere of interference between politics and epistemology. And in adopting such an approach, I would say that neoliberalism is the name of our problem. Agnostic interpreters indicate the fact that the referent of neoliberalism is nothing else than the series of overlapping meanings and orientations. There is no clear-cut doctrine with the architext as dogma or canon, and there is always a risk to treat non-analytically the neoliberalism as the all-purpose denunciatory category. So indeed, within the repertorium of neoliberalism, we could find very divergent trajectories. There is an elite-based orientation determined by the tons a la Leo Strauss and his esoteric knowledge hidden for the masses as vulgus. And this traces us to the illiberal core of neoliberalism that is to be disseminated by the self-conscious and enlightened epistemic collectivities who relentlessly propagate the market as the true, but they are exempted from the algorithm of the laws of the market. Anthony de Yesai, who is highly appreciated thinker in the neoliberal circles, accuses of liberalism for the concession to the democracy. Due to this compromise, it destroys the chance for the affirmation of liberty as immunity. And what is more, for Yesai, being concerned for the normative account of property, the liberalism persistently weakens the supporting of capitalism. So in consequence, only the epistemic collectivities led by the account of the freedom as immunity could highlight the ultimate truth. This opens, of course, for us the issue of relationship between the authoritarianism and freedom, because dictatorship proves to be necessary as the expression of the fact that neoliberal intelligibility must coerce the world to impose its mechanism of sanctions in relation to the fields and people who are tragically heterogeneous vis-à-vis the aforementioned intelligibility. But there is another side of coin. The quotidian hegemony of neoliberalism involves the populist impulses, primitive emotional involvement and popular market-like pleasures in a commodity-producing society. And it is quite possible to depict some forms of self-depiction of neoliberalism by the persistent fight between ideas a la Antonio Gramsci, and although with, so to say, idealistic overtones, not by chance, neoliberalism is presented sometimes as rightist Gramscianism. Indeed, neoliberalism is a mutative Kampfbegriff, in as much as it is exposed to the constant rearticulation, it could be seen as an emerging intelligibility. But if we follow, at least for a while, Hayek yet, we are confronted here with the relationship between politics and epistemology, power and knowledge. In accordance with this, we should practice a myriad of approach from the philosophy of epistemology, such as the medieval debate on nominalism and realism, or Duhem thesis from philosophy of science, etc., etc. The nature of market order of capitalism is understood by Hayek as epistemological, and this order is packaged in the relation between knowledge and being. Not economy, nor politics, but epistemology matters. And to be brief, and the crucial point is the following assertion made by Hayek, stressing, I quote, the necessity in any complex society in which the effects of anyone's action reach far beyond his possible range of vision of the individual submitting to the anonymous and seemingly irrational forces of society, with the consequence that man in a complex society can have no choice but between adjusting himself to what to him must seem the blind forces of the social process and obeying the orders of a superior. We have almost everything here in these short sentences: the unintended effects that reached beyond our visions and our determination to obey blind and superior forces. These effects are not at our disposal, that there is no knowledge of consequences that are beyond our horizon. So there is a constitutive non-knowledge in our social being, and in accordance with this, we are confronted with the inhibition of the critique of visibility concerning the unintended effects. So the next argument, what is of importance for the understanding of neoliberalism, referring to the logic of the as if, clearly highlights the constitutive moment of fiction that permeates crucial segments of society, rearticulated by the neoliberal greed of intelligibility. As we know, this logic was the core concept of the neo-Kantian philosopher Heinz Weichinger. Obviously, the neoliberal orientation differs from his endeavor because it is based on the obsession with the construction of neoliberal subjectivities. But for our purpose, it would be enough to remark that there are no market relationships within the practice of fiction. Bear in mind that it is impossible to re-engineer all human spheres by the market imperatives, but neoliberalism demands from us to imagine, as if, imagine, and constructing market-like solutions for all spheres of society, including education, health, etc. For example, we should behave as if the market as true provides the solution for all aspects of human lives, including politics. And this is the necessary consequence of the orientation that presupposes that the market can legitimize itself automatically and avoiding the burden of legitimization of state at the same time. What about the conceptual difference between classical liberalism and neoliberalism? What consequences implicates the transforming of the meaning of the vogue, of the property, formulated by the classical liberalism? Accordingly to the elegant solution of Michel Foucault, there is a clear demarcation between classical liberalism and neoliberalism. He denotes especially two arguments. First, classical liberalism could evoke the system of natural liberties as the transcendental anchor for its positioning, but neoliberalism cannot call upon natural liberty or the ontology based on natural immanentism anymore. It is forced to affirm itself as the real source of a broad set of governmental practice to construct the relevant situations. Second, The classical liberalism is based on the spiritualized exchange as the candidate for the universalist matrix for the human behavior. But en lieu of exchange, we have in neoliberalism the celebration of unimpeded competition. That is the hubris of concurrence, and the market as the place where the truth speaks to us. And these are, of course, for me, very useful proposals by which we can elucidate the shift that affects the elementary matrix of liberalism, namely the distinction between the private and public and the normative content of liberalism at all. But some uneasiness afflicts me yet. Could we throw away any dilemma concerning the separation between liberalism and neoliberalism, or are we confronted with the much more difficult task in order to save the germ of liberalism? So we are forced to problematize the liberalism as coherent and unified doctrine that ensures the frame for the cohabitation of political and economic aspects. There is no guarantee for the congruence between political and economic liberalism. There are a lot of thinkers in the tradition who accept the norms of economic liberalism, but at the same time express far-reaching doubt toward the principles of political liberalism. In other words, the economic liberalism could sacrifice the norms of political liberalism, presenting the internal split within liberalism. And this split is, let me be misunderstood, not the cause of the genesis of neoliberalism, but proves to be a precondition for it. We have seen already that Yesai has strictly detached capitalism and liberalism, assuming that liberalism is never consequent in the advocating of the freedom as immunity. In reality, there is a trembling, so to say, oscillating relationship between capitalism and liberalism. And what is to be especially explicated is the diachronical and synchronical intertwinements between economic liberalism and capitalism. Let me make clear. The capitalism as the conceptual subject was not treated by liberals. The most important interpreters were the thinkers who combined liberalism with conservatism, such as Joseph Schumpeter or Max Weber, whose liberalism is always debate, of course, but economic liberalism is always exposed to the accumulation and expansionist imperatives of capital. And the alliance, the marriage between economic liberalism and imperialism is not to be interpreted as the pure historical accident. So I will try to shortly demonstrate the interior split within liberalism, referring to the well-known Adam Smith, who is considered as one of the most important representatives of economic liberalism and a frequently mentioned author in all sides. And there are at least two aspects of relevance in this context: benevolent government and benevolent creation of people, security, or more precisely, the relation between security and liberty. And this entails probably the main and latently explosive theoretical and strategical problems for the nascent liberalism. The first assumption counters the standard argument, the standard treatment of Smith as the champion of laissez-faire philosophy or as the unmitigable critic of government-based practice. Smith's orientation is not a quietistic philosophy that contemplates the theologically ordered invisible hand, just to quote his very famous metaphor. I would like to speculate that here, in this context, we confront with the fact that the invisible hand figures only in the context of the government-based practice, only in the context of the strong state. The difficult dilemma of relationship between authority and freedom is even aggravated by Smith in his celebration and apotheosis of the martial spirits as the guarantee of the perfect man. For as we know from different writings of Smith, he has been committed to the military virtue and concerned by the ominous tendency of effeminacy, that has recalled the old term from the Italian political theory, earlier Italian political theory. This we see here a doctrinary knot between sovereignty and security across the military power and the martial spirit. So we should not forget that in accordance with Smith's accounts, the political economy, as the new mode of scientific discipline, is strongly classified as the branch of the science of legislator or statesman. The strong state as the auxiliary hypothesis is definitively involved here. I am forced to say that there is an element of neoliberalism ante litteram in Smith. There are certain operative forces in his philosophy found in neoliberalism as well. But of course we could identify his orientation as liberal only retrospectively. Smith's notion must be mediated through neoliberal categories in order to prepare him for neoliberal constructivism. That is to say that neoliberalism must reinterpret Smith and understand him better than he understands himself in order to forbid a view of the whole social body. But what is interesting yet, as Hobbes is interpreted as the foremost thinker of the fear in the New Age, but Smith maybe points out most clearly the robust role of the fear, naming it as the, I quote, ultimate tormentor of the human breast. In the point of fact, the death, happiness of the death, by Smith, happiness of the dead is described as the final form of security. That is, as the categorically resolved issue of fear. And being the part of the long tradition, Smith forcefully has blamed the members of society exposed to poverty and derogation who could rebel against the ordered society. Actually, Smith's thoughts are strongly animated by the fear, and recalling all his arguments, we are allowed to speak on the conceptual couplet between security and fear. But of course, this is not the exercise in the history of political economic doctrines, but the preludium for the account of the discourse of the fear and the security in the perspective of neoliberalism. This implies that neoliberalism inherits the dangerous issue of the prioritizing security or liberty. What is the first? But neoliberalism has the ambition to cut the Gordian knot between security and freedom, commodification of fear, commodification of security, or more precisely, reflexive commodification. In this sense, the expansion of security industry is the authentic illiberal heart of the neoliberalism. It addresses the customer as the ultimate agents of choice, as the king, but as a fearful, exposed to the insecurity. And this is a paradigmatical shift with a very deep philosophical consequences. En passant, it is not by chance that the security studies are focused on the profound illiberal gist of late capitalism. And coming to the end, I would like to suggest that liberalism is in these dangerous times forced to reflect on this illiberal core of neoliberalism to save its normative capacities, propagating the automatic legitimation of the choice-based market neoliberalism systematically conflates the choice and the consent, or propagates the choice-based meaning of consent. So today we experience the repeated conflation between people's choices and their consent to the political economic structure of constraints that shape the set of given feasible alternatives. And this is the reason that it is so difficult for us to imagine the dissent as the pillar of social evaluation. And this is the reason for us it's so difficult to reflect on the ongoing forms of coercion-mediated processes. Liberalism should keep alive the chances for non-instrumental freedom. But the addressing of these issues presupposes a self-reflection of liberalism in neoliberal era and a serious attempt to reconquer its normative capacities. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much. The task I set up for myself in this talk is rather simply, I would like to revisit and reconstruct to some extent the arguments of George Lukács against liberal democracy. Now the task being simple, you still can wonder what on earth do I want to do with George Lukács in a conference devoted to questions of liberalism, because even though we probably all agree that Lukács' figure would fit easily into the pattern of anti-liberalist, well, he was a committed Marxist, and his faith in unbreakable faith in the Marxist philosophy was practically a constant character of his thinking. Still, one could claim that his ideas, as being a Marxist, run so hard against the grain of contemporary political thought and theoretical self-understanding that would be useless practically to turn back to Lukács and find anything in his thinking that could illuminate contemporary debates. Maybe, but obviously all depends on how we interpret the conditions that brings about certain political situations and precisely the conditions that brought about the contemporary political conjuncture in democracy. If we believe that relationship between political ideas and conditions are historically framed and constituted, then we might find good reasons to revisit certain political situations where alternatives were still present in regards to the contemporary political status quo. We discussed quite a few occasionally about in quite a few occasions about the path dependency of contemporary political conjuncture. It seems to me the path dependency is precisely a historical genealogy. And from this perspective, I find that Lukács has an interesting position and to some extent a privileged position in this historical genealogy, because his political activity as an ideologist, as a thinker, is very much related to critical periods in the democratic development in European history, where precisely the alternatives between different paths were brought about and discussed largely in political community. And Lukács was very much so engaged in these debates back into the starting from the 90s, late 1920s onward. So from this perspective, it can be argued that we can find not only historical but also theoretically salient features in Lukács' ideas that prove to be relevant to the intellectual debates on liberalism today. In any case, we can see, and I think I'll be able to prove that the terms he offered to us as critical liberal democracy are far from being left far behind us, and some of the debates that we had so far hopefully will reflect that, and we can see that Lukács' terms are very much matching to the debates that we have today. Now, just for a quick information about Lukács' engagement in debates over democracy, there are basically three periods in Lukács' life when he was very much so arguing against liberal democracy and for a socialist or communist democracy. It was in between the two war periods in the late 20s, when the new strategy of communist parties were to be elaborated everywhere in Europe, by the way, and Lukács was arguing that bourgeois democracy need to be used as a position, a transitional position to reach a communist democracy. There is a third period it is in 1968 when Lukács published a long essay called The Process of Democratization, in which he both criticized liberal democracy and the Stalinist Marxist approach to democratical development. And there is a position in between, which I would like to revisit, which is the most interesting. It is between basically 1945, so right after the war, up to 1948, which was a very interesting period even in Hungary. Informally, we had a democratic republic. And Lukács' engagement, obviously, as an idol of the Communist Party in debates over democracy, it was very interesting because the plasticity of the political situation apparently brought him into a position where he was not engaged in reflection as an orthodox Marxist, but more as a critical of liberal democracy and fighting for a new conception of democracy, which was not fully equivalent of some orthodox view on communist or socialist democracy. So I would like to discuss this period in a more extensive way. Also, this was the last period in Lukács' life when he was visited international community, and his debates in different places in Europe brought him into a situation when he had a very vivid debate, for example, with thinkers like Karl Jaspers, Meros Merleau-Ponty, Raymond Aron. They met in person and they debated in person over precisely the question of democracy. Now, there's a common element in Lukács, all of the three periods, which is basically Lukács wants to demonstrate that liberal parliamentarism and democracy, which is characteristic of Western democracies, is quite compatible with political inequality and repression in society. And therefore, Lukács argues all the time, it cannot be considered as the only viable option for a democratic organization of society. And precisely this was the view that motivated him to engage seriously with the historical project of giving shape, a truly substantive, a new, fangled, participatory form of democracy. Now, from Lukács' focus was never was simply like he was analyzing current political phenomena in order to understand the political consequences. He was thinking as a philosopher in more larger terms. He wanted to understand the historical trends and tendencies behind recent or current political phenomena and to describe their larger political, social, anthropological consequences and try to understand if there is an alternative in the situation and not, and if there is an alternative, how can one work out it and realize it. So from this point of view, he was fully against the historical status quo, which even at that point in the early 1940s wanted to make us believe that the classic form of democracy was the only possible form of democratic institution of a society. And Lukács basically argues that nothing that can be offered formally by democracy is to be evaluated and respected in itself. In given circumstances, any element of classical democratic political practice and thinking can be turned into an instrument of exploitation, repression, and political reaction. And the task always is to assess concretely and historically what is at stake in a certain democratic situation and try to find the alternative paths. Again, this is a major point in Lukács. Now, in the current situation after the war, for Lukács, the situation of democratic politics is deeply determined by the problem of fascism. So at this point, Lukács' reflection on democracy is very much in terms with the line of argument that was presented yesterday by Alexander, that for him the possibility of fascism within democracy is the major point from which then the whole democratization process in Europe should be reevaluated and reassessed. Because Lukács firmly believes that fascism has not just happened to us, it just came like from an extraterrestrial position. It has grown out organically from democratic politics. And therefore, for him, to understand that in liberal democracy there is an inherent tendency to create circumstances where the turn to authoritarian or fascist or even populist, he doesn't use this word, but sometimes he says semi or quarter-fascist tendencies, it's always a plausible and sometimes a desired means. Because liberal democracy, according to him, fosters, especially in crisis situation, fosters in two ways the potential emergence of fascist tendencies in any democracy. In one way, socially, it makes the population politically defenseless in crisis situation to the emergence of authoritarian tendencies. On the other hand, it offers us as a political mean in order to overcome difficulties when the democratical system are shaken by internal or external problems. So there's always an option for Lukács to turn to fascist or authoritarian means in democracy when there's a problem. And either because the population is already being made defenseless, in fact the population is desiring something different, and therefore there is always the fascist option, and because politicians want to turn to it by intention and using these manners in order to consolidate their position. So for Lukács, in his way, Lukács is always beyond the question of totalitarianism or democracy, or communism or bourgeois democracy. For him, the option is always which form of democracy can overcome the possibility of the possible emergence of fascist tendencies in a democracy. For him, the question is which democracy, and not if totalitarian or democratic position we need to accept. Which form of democracy can possibly rule out the possibility of emergence of fascist tendencies within the very structure of democracy itself. Now, from this point of view, Lukács has, I believe, three different kind of arguments against the current status quo of democracy, which he calls formal democracy, in very much so in line with what Zoltán has portrayed, that it's an empty form of democracy and doesn't really give us any real content. Lukács is saying that exactly. There's a formal democratic, which is characterized as Western democracies, and we need a new content to democratic policy. And he had three kind of arguments against the current status quo of democratic policy. One is, let's say, a social economical argument. Other is an anthropological critique of current democracy, and the political critique of democracy. Now, I want to highlight the basic elements of the three critiques and then just draw a couple of conclusions from that. Now, in his economical critique of democratical development, Lukács basically follows Marx in portraying bourgeois revolution as a process of liberalization, precisely because capitalism liberated the economic forces from ancient social and political control. Economic life became a realm of freedom in a sense that it allowed self-interested production and exchange, and gradually was separated from traditional institutions' political life. Lukács welcomes this, like Marx did, as a basic structure of any form of freedom and liberty in democratical terms. But he basically argues that the hopes of all liberalism, Lukács says, was that the idea of unlimited freedom of action in the economic realm and the idea of political freedom and formal legal equality that comes with it would ensure to all men, by automatic operation of economic processes, happiness and maximum fulfillment. Obviously, Lukács wouldn't agree to this argument, and usually he criticized political democracy by pointing out that even though free production of goods and exchange of goods are embryonic form of democratic development, so there's a counter tendency, which is precisely that free economical processes give life to possible trends toward monopolization of interest, in which the emerging form of anti-democratic processes are very likely. So Lukács detects in economy the splitting up of formal and concrete elements, something which Zoltán called a polarization very early, and says equality is provided formally to all kind of activities, especially in the economic sphere, but concretely de facto, free economy stands in a way of creating conditions of equal and equally enriching forms of economic, social, and cultural development. So there's a formal element which is important, there's a material element which is, and the conflict between the two is coming from the economical structure of any bourgeois democracy. So even for Lukács, even when there is in bourgeois formal democracy, every individual is accorded the right to participate in political life. The main concerns of individuals are subjected to economic forms of coercion, and therefore the vast majority of people are not subject of democratic participation and control because they cannot afford to do that. And on the contrary, because of its economic leverage, a wealthy minority has inordinate means to manipulating the political process and the economic process according to its own interest. Now, you would guess that Lukács' argument against this economical conjuncture would be like, as a classical Marxist, let's abolish private property. But not at all. I mean, at this very position we are in 45, Lukács, although he is Marxist and he believes in the background way of the economic determination of social life, with respect to abolition of private property and the socialization of economy in 45 and 46, the prospect in post-war Hungary were relatively limited, and therefore capitalist-force relationships were likely to persist for quite a long time at that point. So Lukács does not propagate for as a solution to abolish private property. He chooses a different option. He says the option right now is not to abolish private property, rather to recompensate these shortages of liberal democracy on economic level by a cultural and political means. Here comes his anthropological critique of democracy, which is practically saying that economical liberty introduces to contemporary society the split up again, the polarization between public life and private life. And public life remains an abstract field of practice of freedom and political liberty, but in fact, what goes on at the public life is always a caricature of genuine political participation, and all political activities are channeled as economic activities too, towards the private life. So this privatization of the politics means the dying out of the citoyen as a real political agent, and the emptying out of the politics into formal democracies. That's why they are formal, as a concrete and genuine political participation and control over democratic institutions. Here, again, he follows Marx and his Marx critique, as is included in the Jewish question and the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, by stating out that the civil society and state is split up, and the civil society dies out in every form of democracy. What remains there is the state and its economic power, and all politics is displayed and portrayed according to this principle. The economical liberty gives shape to a formal form of liberty, which is basically the harm principle as being formulated by Mill. Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else, but doesn't give a positive determination of freedom. What should we do in order to keep in functioning democratic institutions? What is democracy as social practice? That's formal democracy is not able to offer as a principle. Formal democracy of liberalism transforms man into a private individual, and the disappearance of the citizen is not only an impoverishment or despiritualization of political life. There is always a total separation between the political elite and the masses. And in liberalism, there's a fear and the contempt on the masses that are emerging, and Lukács is very clear on that. There's no middle class, he would say, but not even no one. There's no political population as such. There's an elite and the undefined, opaque population, which is used for political purposes, but never given the chance of participating concretely in political life. So in modern world, the citoyen, the political agent, dies out, and what survives the private isolated individual, man is found, is cut into two parts, and that's, from an anthropological point of view, the lethal consequences of formal democracy. Now, Lukács' model again is not that. Then, where is the proletariat, and let's make a revolution? He says, no, the chance is neither to abolish private property, nor to propagate for a communist revolution, but to alter this system, and the option is there, he says, by cultural and political means. And here comes his third critique, the political critique of formal democracy, because he repeats the formal democracy as being an emptied out formal institution without real anthropological and social contact. And which means that the political crisis of liberal democracies consists in the fact that it is possible to establish all the necessary institutions. It is possible to bring in and behave according to entirely all the formal rules that can be imagined in democracy: universal suffrage, legal equality right, free press, free speech, rights of assembly, anything you can have, and still democracy can neglect the will of the people and create basic social and political inequality. So that's the paradox for Lukács, that you can have everything but formally right in democracy, and still you have an unjust society. How is it possible for him? And obviously the possibility is encoded into the economic and anthropological conditions of democracy, the split between the formal and material elements being the concrete social agents and their will and their possibility to express their political wills and desires, and the fascism emerges for Lukács precisely the desire for people for a political immediacy. That's the only way, according to Lukács, the people want participation. They're formally cut off from it by the democratic system. Therefore, they look for new ways of immediacy, and they found it in the way of fascism, of populism, and all kind of radical right-wing activities. So the reason why in democracy, the formal democracy, the fascism is coded, because the need for immediacy is an anthropological social need for the social agents. And if they don't find democratic means, they will find another way. And that's where fascism is a constant danger in democracy. Now, from this point of view, follows also that liberalism, according to Lukács, is unable to provide substantive form of collective public activity that can grow through political decisions. Liberal politics is a protection of individual freedoms, but is not able to constitute any positive possibility of political community and political practice whatsoever. The state reabsorbs the realm of political, and it fails to provide a conceptual political participation. Obviously, there's a democratic education in every form of democracy, but it is for Lukács only for the education for vote. So to take part into the already established democratic institution, and he goes in the same way like Zoltán, that he says education is important because without education, the political intelligibility in order to know on which decision is made in voting is impossible. So people are not educated in order to understand what is going on. They're educated in order to go and vote for an option they don't understand. And that's what political democracy is able to provide at this level. So, and here's the need for a new democracy. And the new democracy is precisely the reform or evolution of formal democracy, not by economical means, not by political means, but by cultural means. And for Lukács, the new option for democracy is a cultural project. It is education, it is creating new institutions, and that's where the alternative democracy is practically for Lukács are framed in generating the possible ways of social participation and rechanneling them into the core of democratic politics in a new society. So from here follows three conclusions. Obviously, the failure of liberal democracy for Lukács is that one defends liberal freedom and equality without a belief or a hope that the future can ever correct the severe political and social deficiencies emerging from this very democratic practice and theory. So he says, we're defending something which we know that it's never going to be just, and therefore it's an absolutely, not simply paradoxical, but it's dangerous political idea, because there is a sideline, there's always another option, voting for political immediacy in the name of fascism or authoritarianism or populism. Now, for Lukács, it follows that for him, a new type of democracy should be created. And in this very situation after 1945, the question is for him, which democracy can bring a political practice in which the concrete life of the people are reflected and informed and challenged. And as you would guess, and he would guess that he would vote for a direct democratic oppression solution. No, Lukács says that direct democracy is needed against formal democracy, but no state, and he says explicitly, cannot be governed by direct democratic means. So the political life should be based on traditional formal democratic political institutions, but you need to incorporate into the system a new direct democratic institutions, which works at the level of every institution or the workplaces, which can ensure that the initiative of people in making run and control these institutions, the workplaces, is precisely a political option to help them to channel them back into the political realm and give them chances to concretely decide about political options. Democracy should bring about new forms of political participation as a practical life principle, Lukács says, and not simply a formal political option. So he says that the solution is creating new forms of direct democratic participation within the realm of formal democracies, and that's a cultural educational question too. And it's very interesting from this point of view that when it comes to concrete examples, in 45 and 47, Lukács says that we have concrete historical examples. How can it be created? Because during the war, and he says, in Yugoslavia and in France, in the French resistance, in the effort directed against the fight against fascism, a citoyen came into being and became a member of active community. And it was precisely the reason why fascism could have been defeated, because there was a solidarity and direct democratic political practice created in the circumstances of resistance against fascism in many countries, in the Soviet Union, in France, and Yugoslavia. He mentions several times Yugoslavia. He goes as far as saying that, I quote, the supremacy, in 47, the supremacy of Yugoslavia over its neighbors can be traced back to the fact that its state apparatus has grown up organically from immediate democratic forms of activities that were created in the fight for liberation. For him, the concrete historical example for creating democratic forms of activities, immediate forms, are the resistance as new emergence, new form of solidarity in a political crisis situation. He says it several times that Yugoslavia is the example. How can democratic state can be created out of immediate political actions? And the last bit of my conclusion is that when Lukács goes to Geneva in 46 in order to debate on the future of Europe, he's one of the major intellectuals invited, and there is a big, very interesting figure there. He tells, like Jean-Val, Raymond Aron, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Carl Jaspers, and it's a very famous debate between Jaspers and Lukács. And Lukács says all this criticism. And when the time comes to the solution, he says, the chance of Europe is to go back to the position of 1941, the Yalta Congress, and to try to make the Soviet Union and Western power to ally in order to create a new democratic situation for Europe. That's the solution for the new democracy for Europe. That's the path we should follow. And Merleau-Ponty stands up and says that, I think there's a contradiction in your talk. You just demonstrated that in formal democracy there's always an inherent fascist tendency. And now you're saying that Soviet Union and communist country should merge with the formal democracies. So therefore, how is it possible that you're offering a harsh critique of formal democracies, and then in your solution you say that these communist socialist democracies should be somehow brought into the level of formal democracy, going back to the 1941 political situation. And Lukács says, like, yes, I'm aware that I'm in a paradox situation, and I quote, I'm in a paradoxical situation. Every word I say comes from Marxism, which tends to create socialism. But realizing socialism today would be a disastrous idea. I think today the goal is not to establish socialism, it is to produce a defense reaction against fascism and the emergence of fascist tendencies. Now, socialist democracy or communism obviously ruled out by history, but I let you wonder from this point to what extent the angle of defeating fascism can be even today a perspective from which democratic policy should be assessed. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me say firstly that I'm sorry I wasn't here yesterday, and especially I'm sorry I missed the debate yesterday. I wanted to take part in it. Today I will talk about democracy and as a contested concept, and I would like to continue what Adam Takács talked about, because it's a very similar argument. As you see, I want to talk about socio-structural critique of formalistic approach. And what does democracy mean? Sovereignty of the people. Which people? Are they citizens? Nation? Class? If you answer nation, then you will face danger of fascism. And I'm afraid that European Union goes in this direction right now. If you answer class, then you will talk about poor majority. You will come back to ancient definition of democracy. So rule of poor majority in its selfish interest. And it is basically very similar to socialist definition of democracy. And if you answer citizens, then it could be translated into liberal democracy, but not necessarily. Universal suffrage, for sure. You cannot have democracy without universal suffrage. Procedure, it is quite a liberal definition. You can hear very often that democracy is just about procedure. And I'm strongly in opposition towards this definition. Has it changed its meaning since ancient times? Yes. Yes. And what are the ideological functions of different definitions of democracy? We will talk about briefly. I would try to put at the table some points of issues related to democracy. Is it based in sovereignty of people? Is democracy necessarily based in a national state? So any democracy we faced up to now has been rooted in nation state. Is it possible to realize democracy in supranational political communities, for instance, European Union? Is it possible to make democratic polity in capitalist, basically oligarchic society? Was it possible to make it in socialist, basically authoritarian societies? Is it possible that oligarchic or authoritarian political parties which operate in oligarchic socio-economic conditions, big business, powerful lobbies, etc., by means of mutual competition and universal suffrage create substantially democratic political system? What are the realms of democratic polity in a rapidly globalizing capitalist society? Could one talk about democracy only in terms of political regimes? Are certain socio-structural and cultural conditions necessary for realization of substantial and not only formal democracy? I do not have ambitions to answer all those questions, but I want to bear all these questions in our mind. One should be quite clear that American political scientists introduced ideological hegemony in political science at the beginning of the 1950s. And this ideological hegemony has endured to these days. Hans-Peter Kriesi, political scientist from Switzerland, talks about really existing democracy. And you can compare it with really existing socialism during the Cold War. Robert Dahl has introduced in 1956 a concept of Madisonian democracy. The problem with this is that James Madison was against democracy. A landowner and an ideological follower of Montesquieu and Hume, one of the founding fathers of the USA and the philosopher of the Constitution, was not in favor of democratic republic, but he was in favor of a liberal one. And this is quotation. Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith, and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. In this quotation, Madison repeated ancient Aristotelian argument against democracy. Majority is dangerous. That is why we need republic and not democracy. Madison was in favor of republican government and not democratic government. And the Federalist, or if you like, the Federalist Papers, are against democratic rule. It is a liberal document. And liberalism and democracy was in high tension at the time. Nevertheless, Robert Dahl wrote about Madisonian democracy. And he was aware of tension. He said, however, in Madison's day, the term democracy was less common than in ours. To some extent, it was associated with radical equalitarianism. It was also ambiguous because many writers, including Madison, as we have seen, that's my remark, had defined it to mean what we today would call direct democracy, non-representative democracy. The term republic was frequently used to refer to what we would be more inclined to call representative democracy. Contemporary British political philosopher Ross Harrison is even more explicit when he says that it is not necessary to follow Madison's usage of the term because we would call democracy the issue that he talks about even if he would not agree with us. So, in my opinion, Cold War directly influenced on the meaning of democracy in political science. And political scientists wanted to describe real functioning of democracy, not of democracy, but of political system, and then called it democracy. Although, till the end of the First World War, it wasn't like this at all, And in interval period, it was kind of the beginning, because socialism and fascism were strongly in opposition, and then theories of totalitarianism was instrumental regarding the struggle, and theories of democracy after the Second World War, combined with theories of totalitarianism, were used against enemies of liberalism. But if you want to seduce citizens, you have to talk about democracy and not about liberalism. And that is why liberal democracy has appeared as basic concept. I would also like to quote some of the American revolutionaries. It might be enlightened. Cribbing and confining the popular spirit that has been at large since 1776 were essential to the purposes of the new Constitution. Edmund Randolph, saying to the Convention that the evils from which the country suffered originated in turbulence and follies of democracy, and that the great danger lay in the democratic parts of our constitutions. Elbridge Gerry, speaking of democracy as the worst of all political evils. Roger Sherman, hoping that the people have as little to do as may be about the government. William Livingstone, saying that the people have ever been and ever will be unfit to retain the exercise of power in their own hands. George Washington, the presiding officer, urging the delegates not to produce a document of which they themselves could not approve simply in order to please the people. Hamilton, charging that the turbulent and changing masses seldom judge of determining right, and advising a permanent government body to check the imprudence of democracy. The wealthy young planter Charles Pinckney, proposing that no one be president who was not worth at least $100,000. All these were quite representative of the spirit in which the problems of government were treated. All the quotations were written by Richard Hofstadter. And indeed, Hofstadter is right when he warned his generation that nowhere in America or Europe, not even among the great liberated thinkers of the Enlightenment, did democratic ideas appear respectable to the cultivated classes. French liberal Benjamin Constant thought of direct democracy as inconvenient, if not impossible, in contemporary commercial world. Indeed, liberal understanding of democracy is at least partially inspired by commercial interests. And that is probably the main problem with liberal democracy, because liberalism is an ideology of capitalism, basic ideology of capitalism. And there is no democracy without relative equality among citizens. And there is no capitalism without extremely rich minority of the people and poor majority or significant minority of the people. Democracy and capitalism have been mutually opposite. really existing democracy is much more liberal than democracy. And that is the problem we face. How could we think about democracy if we live in capitalism? But was the socialism a solution? Democracy cannot be authoritarian. And really existing socialism or people's democracy was an authoritarian system. Democracy and socialism we faced were mutually opposite. So how could we cope with these problems? Could we realize ideals of enlightenment? Marx and Marxists criticized bourgeois democracy as only formal, because political equality does not produce social inequality, and Adam Takacs talked about it. If property remains private, general voting rights are nothing more than delusion of broader social strata. What are the criteria for democracy? Maybe if we face criteria for democracy, maybe we can approach more closely what democracy should be and how it could be realized. So inclusiveness, for sure. Universal suffrage. It is a must. Application of some force of direct democracy. And it is what Lukács talked about. Referenda, petitions, people's initiatives. It's necessary, if you want to talk about democracy, to introduce some direct democratic institutions. Active social protest movements. It's extremely important. Grassroots movements. For instance, in southeastern part of Serbia, Niš, it is probably the first successful social movement after 1990. Relatively equal life chances, if not life conditions. Importance of redistribution of wealth in capitalist societies. I think it is vital if we want to talk about democracy. Political regime versus social system. Some examples. India. We heard a lot of times that India is the oldest democratic system in non-European countries. But it is caste society even today. Could caste society be treated as really a democratic one? USA up to 1964, was it caste society, oligarchy, or Madisonian democracy? Colored, black people, Afro-Americans, earned citizen rights only in 1964. So obviously it was caste society. And it was known as the oldest democracy. How could be? USA today, oligarchy or democracy? Yes. 237 members of Congress are millionaires. It's 44% of the body compared to about 1% of Americans overall. So it isn't strange that such rich people issue laws against the majority of the American nation. As former ambassador in Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Serbia and Montenegro, William Montgomery has recently stressed, for a successful candidacy to any more important public function, one has to provide tens of millions of dollars, and for a presidential candidacy, it has to be over $1 billion. That is why collecting money has been becoming full-time job for legislators, and all big donors expect reward for their contributions. Nothing surprising. But if you have such distinctive material interests, you can talk only about oligarchy and not democracy at all. You know that I'm working a bit in practical politics since several months ago, and one calculation says that party needs 1 million euros just for a year in order to function. 55,000 for registration of political party. If you wanted to have 20 offices in Serbian cities and only one employee and 2 cars, gasoline, you need approximately €1 million. And if you want to have a noticeable campaign in terms of media, you have to collect $2 or $3 million more. And how is it possible to collect money for such purposes and not to get it from rich oligarchs, because they are only people who have money? And if they put money into our political machine, we will be their servants. And what about democracy? Greece, yesterday and today, oligarchy or democracy? I remember very well 11 years ago at the University of Oxford when Richard Clogg, probably the most enlightened British scholar regarding Greece, talked about that 150 members of parliament at the time had fathers and grandfathers as members of parliament. So obviously it is oligarchy, and we know it was oligarchy, and we know dynasties, Papandreou, Karamanlis, Mitsotakis, and we know also some dynasties in the USA, Kennedy, Bush, Clinton. So obviously they are oligarchic systems comparable to Roman Republic, late Roman Republic, and not at all comparable to Athens. And former socialist societies, yes, today's Greece, is it oligarchy? Or maybe the only result that Syriza realized has been abolishment of essentially oligarchic system. But the problem is that Syriza operates under umbrella of world capitalist system. And how could anyone dream on realization of democracy under conditions imposed by world capitalist system? Former socialist society, authoritarian regimes, oligarchies or democracies? It seems to me that they were authoritarian regimes. They wanted to think of themselves as providers and people who talks on behalf of people, but they impose their own will at the people. So it cannot be democracy. And welfare states, oligarchies or democracies? I think that Zoltan Pogačar talked about Thomas Piketty, and indeed Thomas Piketty showed that inequality sharply decreased during the 3 glorious decades between 1945 and 1975. So 3 glorious decades in France. And today, Piketty also shows inequalities has increased almost to the level of the First World War, when it was at the highest point. So we are very close to this highest point of inequalities. So welfare states probably were the closest to the democratic ideal. Certainly they were not democracies in terms of fulfillment of ideals. But probably it was the closest. However, welfare states were only possible because of socialist threat. USSR and satellites were serious threat, and capitalists had to accommodate themselves in order to escape revolution in Western societies. Without threat, there is no hope for democracy. And this is also my fear, especially in light of recent developments in European Union. I think that my Hungarian colleagues will not be angry on me if I say that Hungarian state is probably one of the most shameful examples of wide European behavior towards the immigrants. And Lukács wrote about fascist threat, and we face it. We face it, and obviously liberal democracy is not strong enough to face this threat. Okay, I will. Yeah, and yes, just a short remark. I think that one has to combine, and this is very similar what Lukács wrote before in 1940s or 50s. One should combine direct and indirect democratic institutions, and one should be aware of some liberal values. So if we are strongly against economic liberalism, and I am, still one has to recognize some civilizational values: right to life, civil rights, rule of law and constitutional limitations and separation of the powers of government, freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press are necessary. They are not sufficient, but they are necessary for protection of democracy from authoritarian tendencies. And I'm sorry, I apologize for